The telephone rang at 2:47 in the morning. Nobody picks up a phone at that hour expecting good news. Colonel Harold Briggs, senior liaison officer from SHAF headquarters, reached for it anyway with the practiced calm of a man who had trained himself to feel nothing before coffee. What he heard on the other end made him sit straight up in his cot. General Patton's Third Army was moving, not scheduled to move, not authorized to move, moving. Briggs was dressed and in a jeep before the call ended. Luxembourg, late autumn 1944. The front had stabilized into something that war planners like to call a strategic pause, and frontline soldiers called something considerably less polite. The Siegfried Line stretched across the horizon like a scar on the earth, fortified, patient, waiting. Supreme Headquarters in Paris had decided that the Allied advance needed to slow down, needed to consolidate gains, needed to wait for supply lines to catch up with the ambition that had carried the liberation of France at a speed nobody had anticipated. The orders were clear, formalized, signed by men with enough stars on their shoulders to make the directive feel like gravity. No unauthorized advances, no independent operations. The entire front would move together, coordinated, deliberate, safe. George Smith Patton, Jr. had read those orders, had held them in his hands, standing in the converted farmhouse his staff used as a command post, while outside the November wind came down from Germany like it had a personal opinion about the war. He'd read every word, and then he'd looked up at his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, with those pale blue eyes that had unnerved better men than most, and said one sentence that Gay would remember for the rest of his life. "The enemy doesn't know we've stopped." By the time Briggs arrived at the command post, the farmhouse was lit up like Christmas, and humming with the concentrated energy of men engaged in something between controlled chaos and genius. Maps covered every flat surface. Radio operators spoke in clipped bursts. Runners moved in and out. The whole machine of the Third Army was awake and deliberate, and aimed at a specific point in the German line 40 miles east that Patton had identified 3 days ago as the place where the enemy was thinnest, most tired, most surprised. Briggs walked in and immediately understood that he was the only person in the building who didn't know exactly what was happening. That feeling of being the only uninformed man in a room of informed ones was a particular kind of powerlessness that bureaucracies never quite prepared you for. He found Patton standing over the largest map, a cup of cold coffee in one hand, a grease pencil in the other, marking something with the focused satisfaction of a sculptor making a final cut. "General Patton." Briggs kept his voice level. He'd been briefed on Patton. Everyone was briefed on Patton before they met him, the way you'd be briefed on weather conditions before a difficult flight. "There are reports that your forces are advancing on the Saar corridor without authorization from SHAF. I need to know if those reports are accurate." Patton looked up from the map. He was 59 years old, and in that moment he looked both older and younger than that simultaneously. Older in the way monuments are old, worn into permanence by force and time. Younger in the eyes, where something still burned with the irritating vitality of a man who had not yet done everything he intended to do. "Those reports are accurate," he said, and went back to the map. Briggs blinked. He'd prepared for denial, for deflection, for the various forms of careful language that generals used when they wanted to do one thing and be documented as doing another. He hadn't prepared for plain acknowledgement delivered without apology or explanation, like a man telling you the temperature outside. "Sir, General Eisenhower's directive is explicit. No unauthorized advances. You have been specifically ordered to hold your current position until coordinated movement along the entire front can be arranged. You don't have the authorization to move." Patton set down his grease pencil. He picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. He turned to face Briggs fully, and Briggs felt the weight of that attention the way you feel a change in pressure, something physical, something that went beyond rank and protocol into that older territory where men measure each other by something that predates armies and headquarters and authorization forms. "Harold," Patton said, and his voice was unhurried in the way a river is unhurried, knowing exactly where it was going. "I've been fighting Germans since 1917. I fought them in the Argonne when you were still in school. I know when a line is thin. I know when a man is tired. I know when an army is telling you with the spacing of its units and the angle of its retreat and the silence of its artillery that it is very close to breaking. And that line, right there," Patton turned and put his finger on the map with the certainty of a surgeon marking an incision point. "That line is telling me all three things tonight. Sir, with respect, that assessment needs to go through proper channels. Intelligence needs to be verified. Logistics needs to confirm supply capacity. If you advance without coordination, you risk outrunning your fuel, your ammunition. You risk creating a salient that the Germans can exploit from both flanks. You risk serious casualties for a gain that the broader strategy may not even require right now. Patton listened to all of this. He was good at listening, which surprised people who expected a man of his reputation to be all noise. He listened the way hunters listen, completely still, absorbing everything, missing nothing. When Briggs finished, Patton walked to the window. Outside, in the darkness, you could hear it if you knew what to listen for. The distant mechanical rumble of armor moving. The Third Army, already gone, already through the gap, already doing the thing that everyone in this room was still discussing whether it should be done. "You know what a vacuum is, Harold," Patton said. "Not the machine. A vacuum, the physical phenomenon. What happens to a vacuum?" Briggs said nothing. This felt like a test with a wrong answer waiting. Nature abhors it. Something always fills it. Always. You can't have an empty space in the physical world because the surrounding pressure will collapse it the moment you create it. Wars are the same. When an army retreats, when a line thins, when discipline begins to fray inside an enemy formation, you have a vacuum. A real one, and if you don't fill it immediately, the enemy fills it himself. He rests. He reorganizes. He rotates his best units to that position. He brings up his reserves, and tomorrow the vacuum is gone, and what you have instead is the hardest ground you've ever tried to take. He turned from the window. "Every hour I wait tonight costs me 3 days next week. Schaff counts divisions and fuel tonnage. I count hours. Sir, I hear what you're saying, but I am not here to debate strategy. I am here to inform you that you are in direct violation of a standing order from Supreme Headquarters, and that I am required to report this. If I report it, there will be consequences. Serious ones. They could relieve you of command. You understand that. I've been threatened with relief of command 11 times since North Africa," Patton said, and somewhere in that sentence was the faintest trace of something that might have been amusement. If they were going to do it, they had ample opportunity. "They won't do it tonight." "Why not?" "Because tonight I'll have taken Saarbrücken, and in the morning they'll have to decide whether to relieve the general who just handed them a strategic breakthrough or give him a medal and pretend it was always the plan." Patton walked back to his map with the calm of a man who had already finished the argument in his head and was simply waiting for reality to catch up. "I know how headquarters thinks, Harold. I know how Ike thinks. He is a political general. That is not an insult. It is an observation. He manages coalitions and alliances and press relationships and supply committees, and he is brilliant at it. But political generals need results to defend. I am going to give him a result tonight that no political calculus in the world will ask him to disavow." Briggs stood in the middle of the farmhouse and felt the strange vertigo of watching a man operate on a frequency that his own training had never quite reached. He'd gone to West Point. He understood doctrine, logistics, coordination, all the formal architecture of modern warfare. And standing here, none of it felt adequate. It was like showing up with a blueprint in a world that was already built. One of Patton's radio operators looked up. "General, Colonel Cohen reports the armored column is through the first line. Resistance was minimal. They're requesting confirmation to continue to the second objective." Patton didn't hesitate. "Tell him to continue. Tell him not to stop until he runs out of Germans or fuel, and to let me know immediately if either happens." "Sir." Briggs made one more attempt, because his orders required it, and because somewhere beneath the protocol, he genuinely wasn't certain who was right. "You're gambling with men's lives on an assessment that hasn't been vetted by intelligence." Patton turned to look at him, and something in his expression shifted. Not to anger. Something more complicated than anger. "I'm not gambling," he said quietly. "Gambling is what you do when the outcome is uncertain. I am not uncertain. Every commander who ever lived had two choices in the moment before contact. He can know what he knows and act on it, or he can defer what he knows to people who know less and call that caution. I have never been able to call it caution. I've watched men die waiting for authorization to do the thing that needed doing an hour earlier. I've watched ground fall that didn't have to fall because someone 200 miles away with a clean uniform needed to consult another someone with a cleaner uniform before they could agree that yes, the enemy is indeed where the men on the ground can literally see them. I will not do that to my soldiers." The farmhouse had gone subtly quiet. Patton's staff were still working, still on their radios and their phones, but at a reduced volume, the way people lower their voices without realizing it when a conversation becomes important. Briggs sat down in a camp chair that wasn't his. He sat down because his legs decided it was appropriate without consulting the rest of him. "What do you want me to report to Chef?" he asked. "The truth," Patton said simply. "That Third Army identified a critical vulnerability in the German line. That acting on time-sensitive intelligence, I committed forces to exploit that vulnerability before it closed. That the operation is proceeding successfully. That by the time your report reaches General Eisenhower's desk, the outcome will be clear enough that the question of authorization will be a historical footnote. And if it doesn't go successfully, then you'll have a much shorter report to write, because I'll have handed Schaff everything they need to relieve me, and our conversation will be the least interesting part of the whole story." Briggs looked at this man, this deliberate, infuriating, entirely unreasonable man, and tried to find the category in which he properly belonged. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't indifferent to risk. He wasn't some romantic cowboy firing instinct over method. He was, in a way that was difficult to name, simply operating at a different resolution than everyone around him. Where others saw variables and uncertainties and required analysis, Patton seemed to see something already resolved, a future already determined by forces already in motion, and the only real question was whether the men authorized to act would act quickly enough to be the ones who shaped it. At 4:15 in the morning, the radio crackled with word from Colonel Cohen. The second German line was broken. Armor was moving freely through the gap. Prisoner count was already in the hundreds and climbing. The division that had held that sector, the 36th Volksgrenadier, was in full retreat toward the Rhine. The farmhouse erupted in controlled celebration, the restrained professional satisfaction of men who had planned something difficult and watched it work exactly as intended. Maps were updated. Reports were drafted. The machine of victory ran through its processes. Patton looked at Briggs across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The map said it. Briggs sat with the particular discomfort of a man who has just been proven wrong, in a way that makes proving him wrong look like the most responsible possible outcome. He thought about the orders in his briefcase. He thought about the men who had signed them, men of enormous experience and genuine intelligence, men who had built the logistics infrastructure that was keeping 3 million Allied soldiers in the field. He thought about the fact that those men, with all of that experience and all of that intelligence, had looked at the same front he was looking at tonight and seen a reason to pause. And he thought about Patton, who had looked at the same front and seen the opposite. "You were right," Briggs said finally. "I was prepared," Patton said, and there was a distinction in that correction that Briggs only half understood in the moment and would spend the rest of his life thinking about. Right suggests luck, accident, coherence of judgment and outcome. I wasn't right. I was prepared. I knew that line because I had spent 3 weeks learning it. I knew the German commander opposite me because I had read everything ever written about him and interviewed every prisoner we pulled from his sector. I knew my own supply lines to the hour, not to the day. I knew my men's condition to the unit, not to the division. When I moved tonight, I wasn't guessing. I was reading a text I had already studied. But you didn't have authorization. No, Patton agreed. I had something more useful. He picked up his grease pencil and turned back to the map. He made a single line, clean and decisive, marking the new front that the Third Army would occupy by morning. He said, "I had certainty." The next morning, General Eisenhower received the report from Schaff. He read it twice. He sat quietly for a long moment. Then he told his aide to get Patton on the telephone. When the connection came through, there was a pause on the line. And then Eisenhower said, in the dry, careful voice of a man composing his response with some care, "George, you are the most difficult subordinate in the history of the United States Army." And Patton, standing in his farmhouse with the sounds of victory still echoing in the hills to the east, said, "Sir, I am also the most effective." There was another pause. Then Eisenhower said, "Don't do it again without telling me first." And he hung up. Briggs flew back to Paris that afternoon. He spent the flight staring out at the November clouds and trying to articulate something that he felt but couldn't quite formalize. He had spent his entire career learning systems, protocols, chains of command, the procedural architecture that allowed large organizations to function without descending into chaos. He believed in those systems. He still believed in them. They existed for good reasons, and the world was better for them existing. But there was something Patton had, something that the systems he believed in were not designed to produce and could not fully contain. It wasn't arrogance, though it looked like arrogance from the outside. It wasn't recklessness, though the people most threatened by it called it that. It was something closer to what happened when genuine mastery met genuine urgency and refused to let protocol stand between them. An understanding so thorough, so granular, so specific that it transcended the summary judgments that organizations ran on and became its own authority. Authorization, Briggs wrote in his report that night, is the formal recognition that someone has the right to act. But there is a prior question that we rarely ask, which is whether the person asking for authorization actually understands the situation better than the people who would grant or deny it. In the case of General Patton and the action of November 19, 1944, the answer to that question was clearly yes. The authorization structure exists to prevent bad decisions. It is not designed for the moments when the person without authorization is the only person in the room with enough knowledge to make the right one. He stopped, read what he had written, and crossed out the last paragraph. It was true, but it was the kind of truth that made institutions nervous, and Briggs was an institution man. He understood, writing it, that this was the gap Patton lived in, the place where genuine understanding outran formal authority, where the person who knew was not always the person permitted to act, where waiting for permission cost more than acting without it. He understood it. He still wasn't sure it was right. He suspected Patton had never lost a single night's sleep wondering. By December, the Third Army had advanced further, faster, through terrain more difficult, with fewer casualties than any comparable Allied operation in the Western theater. Historians would argue about the reasons for decades, about supply lines and German morale and weather, and the particular character of the American soldier in the autumn of 1944. They would note the controversies, the confrontations with commanders, the near reliefs and the reprimands, the long, complicated record of a general who was undeniably effective and frequently ungovernable. But in the farmhouse in Luxembourg, at 2:47 in the morning, when Harold Briggs walked in with his orders and his authorization language and his genuine conviction that the right answer was to wait, there was a much simpler thing happening. There was a man who understood the difference between the authority to act and the knowledge to act, and who had decided, as he always decided, that knowledge was the thing that mattered. "You don't have authorization to advance," Briggs had told him. And Patton, standing over his map, had said something he had been saying in one form or another since the first moment anyone had tried to substitute their permission for his understanding. He had said, "I am the command."